Hello and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Make this your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead and get started. NATO allies are debating how to deal with Ukraine's plan to eventually join the alliance. The upcoming NATO summit in Washington, D.C. will issue a joint statement on the matter, but the exact wording is still being debated.
Ukraine has been seeking NATO membership for years, even writing it into its constitution in 2018. However, Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion 8 years later has complicated the issue, as the alliance does not want to be drawn into an open war with Russia. This has led to disagreement over how to frame the alliance's position on the issue. The Euromaidan press reports on the backroom discussions on the wording of a statement on this issue. Germany and the US reportedly want to say that Ukraine has a bridge to NATO, while other countries are aiming for the term irreversible path. The stronger wording is supported by United Kingdom and most Eastern Flank members, but not Hungary, which has taken the softest line on Russia of the 32 members. Others are wary of the term irreversible because Ukraine is required to adopt a series of anti-corruption and democratic reforms before being granted membership. A key step on Ukraine's path to NATO would be the establishment of a timeline. This was not done at last year's summit in Vilnius, and this year's summit is expected to move the membership process forward. Still, Kyiv is unlikely to be allowed to join the alliance and enjoy the benefits of the Mutual Defense Clause before the conclusion of the war with Russia.
At the beginning of May, Russia opened a new front in Ukraine, reinvading the Kharkiv region. With the arrival of weapons and the green light to use them on limited targets in Russia, the offensive has stalled, and now Russian troops are slowly being pushed back.
On May 10th, Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border north of Kharkiv and pushed into Ukrainian positions in the area. Their offensive quickly stalled, and Russian units did not advance more than 10 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. As so often in the current war, the fighting stalled for weeks when it reached urban areas, the two towns of Vovchansk in the east and Litsy in the west. Ukraine is reporting unusually high losses on the Ukrainian side, with President Zelensky stating they're 8 times higher than losses on the Ukrainian side. Analysts blame new tactics. Instead of deploying large units, Russia is using small 5-man fire squads to infiltrate Ukrainian positions and merge into larger groups inside enemy territory. This tactic requires highly trained personnel and good communication equipment, both of which the Russian ground forces lack. As a result, units fight scattered, without mutual fire support, and often become isolated and encircled. One Ukrainian unit claims to have surrounded some 400 Russian troops in a chemical plant in Vovchansk. Ukraine is making progress in retaking its territory. In addition to recovering large parts of Vovchansk, the village of Tykhe was reclaimed on Wednesday. While it may take weeks to fully push Russian troops out of the area, controlling land is not the key issue in the current conflict. The war in Ukraine has become a war of attrition, and heavy Russian casualties in a deserted border town is what hurts Moscow most in the grand strategic calculus.
New NATO member Finland is now dealing with a migrant crisis on the border with Russia, similar to that seen by Poland for the last few years. Now, a proposed new law could lessen its impact.
Relations between Russia and Finland deteriorated after Finland joined NATO in April 2023. Support for abandoning neutrality and joining the alliance increased after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Following Finland's decision, large groups of illegal immigrants began arriving at the Russian-Finnish border in mid-2023. Moscow is suspected of supporting the flow of illegal immigrants in order to destabilize Finland. In response, Helsinki completely closed all border crossings with Russia in November 2023. Nevertheless, the flow of migrants continued along the long and difficult-to-police border. Finland is now set to adopt a law which would allow it to temporarily reject asylum claims from migrants who have illegally crossed its border with Russia. The measure was proposed by the current cabinet and has gained preliminary approval from representatives of most parliamentary parties, who called for only minor changes. While Russia may be using migration to wage a hybrid war against Finland, it is incapable of waging any other kind of war. Moscow claims to have reinforced its border after Helsinki joined NATO, but Finnish intelligence reports suggest otherwise. According to the Finnish broadcasting company, about 80% of the men and equipment previously stationed near Finland have been withdrawn. In addition, the report suggests that those remaining are conscripts, as professional soldiers have been sent to Ukraine.
And now for a quick news round. A Russian turtle tank was captured by the AFU. The EU imposes more sanctions, and the latest on Ukrainian grain tariffs.
The war in Ukraine has shown that the sword temporarily wins the race against the shield, or in other words, the armor of most tanks seems to be insufficient for the modern battlefield. This has led Russia to build heavily armored tanks. Ukrainian troops managed to capture a first example earlier this week. These modified vehicles are of limited utility, as they are slow-moving and severely limit the situational awareness of the crew. The makeshift armor of some also makes it impossible to move the gun, essentially turning them into heavily armored infantry carriers. Another 14th package of EU sanctions against Russia was approved despite early opposition from Germany. The Chancellor's office and the Foreign Ministry, run by different coalition parties, reportedly had different views on the issue. The package mainly targets Russian gas exports. It bans the transportation of Russian gas through EU countries to other countries. It also requires that sales to countries used for sanctions evasions be subject to a contractual clause prohibiting such re-exports. The European Union has reimposed tariffs on Ukrainian oats exported to the bloc's countries. This is because the volume of exports has reached a predetermined limit. Tariffs on eggs and sugar are likely next, as the volumes of these products are also close to their quotas. The tariffs have been lifted in 2022 in order to boost the Ukrainian economy. However, this has led to protests from farmers, especially in Poland, who are negatively affected by the measure. The quota system was introduced as a concession to the protesters.
And now we're going to take a look at the situation along the front lines in Ukraine, and we're going to pull up the map. Let's go ahead and take a look at the situation in the Kyiv region, starting off. And of course, we've been talking about that Russian offensive along the border areas there in the Belgorod region, near Vovchansk and further to the north. Now, what's important to report this week is that green light, of course, being given for the use of foreign weapons and ammunition on the other side of the border in the Kyiv region. That continues to produce progress for the Ukrainian armed forces. There have been reports of Ukrainians taking back area along the northern front, and then, of course, near Vovchansk, Ukrainian forces are still working hard to get the Russians completely out of the city. From what we know now, the heart of Vovchansk is, Russians there have been pushed back out of the city, but there's still significant fighting along the outskirts. One thing to take note of is the activity in Kharkiv and the Russian attacks. Usually aircraft releasing glide bombs to attack Kharkiv over in Russian airspace. Another very critical development over the week is that, in fact, the United States has said that it's going to send more Patriot systems and interceptors, enough interceptors to last 16 months for Ukrainian air defense, and some of those Patriots are going to be placed in Kharkiv. The Americans are also saying that the Ukrainians are able to use those weapons to strike targets over Russia as long as they pose a threat to Ukrainian territory. So the likelihood of seeing missiles launched from Kharkiv shooting down aircraft over Russia are very high, and that's something we're definitely going to watch out for in the days and weeks ahead. Well, let's move on now to another report. This one comes from Ukrainian analytical group Deep State. Now, they talk about concentration of Russian forces a little bit to the south of Kupiansk and coming from the Svatove direction and going to the city of Borova. So essentially concentrating about 10,000 troops, making a push on that front. They also needed 450 units of military equipment in the area, and they're just 20 kilometers away. Now, the Institute for the Study of War has said that the Russians have shifted troops up from the Donetsk region to the Kharkiv region, which still seems to be the heart of really all the action as far as Russians making a new push on Ukraine. Of course, that situation down near Avdiivka, I'm not sure if we have the map, and of course, Chasiv Yar, it still remains well, difficult to say the least. Russians have been reported to have made some gains near Chasiv Yar, and then, of course, here near Ocheretny, and I believe it was Novo-Alexandrivka, which has just recently been taken. Of course, the situation here is not changed much. Pokrovsk, a very important city, this road connecting up to Konstantinivka, the Russians are getting very, very close. And of course, that is something the Ukrainians are going to have to focus on, and they're going to have to, they're going to have to stop the Russians in that area and begin to push them back so that they do not lose control of that road, nor the city of Pokrovsk. Well, that's the latest from the front lines in Ukraine. Now I'm going to leave you with some images for just a minute, and we'll be right back.
Владимир, 50. Орудие! Выстрел! Выстрел!
And now it's time to look at the war through a journalist's lens, and for that we're joined by our own TVP World Correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Katerji. Hello, Oz. Thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon.
So last week's peace summit in Switzerland, what is the overall reaction that you're hearing in Kyiv? Was it a success? Was it a failure? A little bit of both? How is it being commented on there?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both is fair. Look, I mean, Ukraine managed to get some of its objectives. It got to keep Ukraine on the world stage. If you look at the period from around the G7 onwards, or even further back slightly, going back to the D-Day celebrations, Zelensky and the Kyiv have had really great results in terms of things they've been asking for from their partners, particularly in the field of air defenses. and the permission to strike targets inside Russia. So they've had a series of diplomatic things go their way. The other one is these new EU sanctions packages, particularly on liquefied natural gas. Again, not necessarily all thanks to this conference, but the conference keeps Ukraine at the top of the news agenda. It got to advance things in areas such as nuclear security, the grain situation, the Black Sea corridor. These are the things that were high up on its agenda: prison returns, prisoner of war swap, etc. They will feel like there were disappointments. Like the Chinese have been running sort of counter diplomacy. Kyiv feels trying to convince countries that may have signed up to the communique to not sign up to the communique, to wait for the Chinese kind of led conference. So, yeah, I think Kyiv will feel aggrieved by Beijing's response to this, which has been quite a hostile response to this conference. It's not one they've endorsed in any way. And consequently, some of the countries in the global south, some of the poorer developing countries that Zelensky was hoping to bring on side with this conference did not eventually sign up that communique. So that will be disappointing for Kyiv. But look, bigger picture, certain things, the US Patriot batteries, missile deliveries, Romania sending its Patriot system, these sanctions, the announcement that these Russian assets are going to be transferred to Ukraine. That's going to begin before the summer break in the EU, and also the talk of the discussions of accession with the EU starting next week. So, look, a lot of positive things are happening for Ukraine at the moment. A lot of the doom and gloom that have been happening because of the ammunition situation and the Russian offensives, those Russian offensives, the back seems to have been broken of those massive pushes now. The Russians are still suffering huge losses, but Ukraine isn't so much on the back foot as it was in the spring and in the winter. So some good news in Ukraine's favor, some slightly things they'll be disappointed with the conference. But I'd say on average, things have looked better for Ukraine this month than they did the last couple of months behind us. Energy situation is still bad here. They're going to need to figure out ways to deal with the energy situation going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Things are starting to look better, certainly on multiple fronts. But yeah, the electricity situation, energy situation is still difficult. Oz Katerji, TVP World Correspondent, joining us live from Kyiv. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ukraine has long pushed its Western backers for additional military capabilities. On Friday, U.S. made a concession that Kyiv has been requesting for months: the permission to use American arms against targets anywhere in Russia, but as long as it poses a threat to Ukraine. It was Ukraine's final and most important demand. Now we await more air defense systems and those F-16s.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said on Friday that Ukraine is allowed to use U.S.-provided weaponry anywhere in Russia with no geographic restrictions. He did qualify his statement, however, saying that Ukraine had to exercise common sense. This was most likely reference to potential strikes against Russian nuclear infrastructure. Russia's official nuclear doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons in case of conventional attack on its nuclear launch sites or the command centers necessary to launch nuclear weapons. The United States and other Western allies have banned Ukraine from using American-provided weapons inside territory up until recently. This has limited Kyiv to the use of Soviet artillery in border areas. Ukraine has also used long-range, domestically built drones in recent months to strike targets hundreds of kilometers from the front lines, mainly oil refineries. Two such facilities, one in the Tambov region and one in Adygea, were struck this week. These attacks are having a significant impact on Moscow's budget as they lower oil output and require expensive repairs. The war is already proving expensive for the Kremlin. Euromaidan Press estimates that Ukraine has destroyed nearly $100 billion worth of Russian military equipment. The restrictions on Western arms became a pressing issue following Russia's Kharkiv offensive, which began in May. As the rear areas and supply dumps are located within Russian territory, as opposed to occupied Ukrainian territory, Kyiv was largely unable to use its tactic of striking Russian logistics. Following Ukrainian pressure, Western allies began granting their approval for strikes within Russia, with the UK's permission granted in early May being a key moment.
In terms of what the Ukrainians do, in our view, it is their decision about how to use these weapons. They're defending their country. They were illegally invaded by Putin, and they must take those steps. We don't discuss any caveats that we put on those things, but let's be absolutely clear. Russia has launched an attack into Ukraine, and Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia.
The US proved most resistant as it wanted to avoid the appearance of direct conflict with Russia. Washington has reportedly taken another key step in order to aid Ukraine. The Financial Times reports that the US has halted the delivery of all Patriot systems, components and missiles to all countries other than Ukraine. The deliveries will be resumed once Kyiv has stockpiled enough equipment to defend its skies.
And now I'd like to welcome here on Ukraine This Week, Sir Ashton-Cirillo, active duty NCO, Armed Forces of Ukraine. Thank you for joining me.
Don, it's a pleasure to be here in the studio again. Every time I have a chance to visit Warsaw to see your incredible team at TVP World, I know that we in Ukraine are not alone with great partners such as the Polish people and yourself.
Well, we like having you. So we've got some pretty positive developments as of late.
Yes.
Let's start off with those Patriots. So it took some time, right?
A little bit, but as they say, it's worth the wait. And one of the most impressive factors about the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, also known as President Zelensky, is that him and his team continue to negotiate, continue to work all the channels necessary to ensure that Colonel General Syrski, our military commander-in-chief, would have the components necessary to liberate Ukraine, return it to the country's 1991 borders. And what we saw recently was the 10-year security compact between Ukraine and the United States. And that has now followed along with the Patriot missile interceptors that are going to be rerouted for some time directly to our front lines in the war against Russian aggression, while at the same time, 5 countries have all stepped up to ensure that Ukraine is going to be getting the actual Patriot missile launchers as well.
Right, and it looks like interceptors are going to be supplied for at least 16 months, which will hopefully not leave us with a gap. We'll be able to plan and make sure it's sufficient, excuse me. But another thing that's interesting here is that probably there's going to be some Patriot batteries in Kharkiv, or let's say the area, and they're going to be able to strike targets above Russia. We've already seen a reduction in the glide bombs falling on Kharkiv. Is this going to be one of those mild game changers, do you think?
I hate to use the term game changer.
Just mild?
You're saying mild, but it will be a difference maker. That's, I think, the best way to say it. And it's going to be a difference maker for several reasons. The first is that the Russians are now aware that the global community isn't just giving Ukraine and myself and our colleagues in the armed forces of Ukraine the weapons necessary to defend. We now have the weapons necessary to carry out a full victory against the Kremlin. The second aspect of it is the psychological aspect for the Ukrainian civilian populace, who has been resilient in the face of Russian terrorism and the Russian genocide against the Ukrainian people. And you brought up Kharkiv. I was along the border in Kharkiv on 2 different trips last month, Vovchansk area and then Zolochiv area. And tremendous impact from the Russian terrorism, from the Russian attacks through these monstrous bombs that are being dropped on the civilian populace. And now what they understand in Russia is if they get too close, their planes are going to start dropping out of the sky. And we aren't just going to be able to strike over the border. It was announced and clarified yesterday evening and then again today from the Pentagon. The United States has given permission for the armed forces of Ukraine to carry out attacks anywhere in Russia that has posed a threat to Ukraine. So that, even more so than what we're getting, allows us to expand, as you would say, the playing field and take the war back to where it belongs, which is taking it to the illegal and illegitimate Moscow regime and make them understand that we are now the ones in control with our partners of the outcome of this war, and that will be victory for Ukraine.
Well, that is indeed important, and especially in the context of glide bombs or missiles, right? As Ukraine's had both of its hands tied behind its back,
Absolutely.
literally unable to defend itself. Well, I hope we do see significant developments there. Now, F-16s, they're about to arrive. I know there's a problem with training all the pilots. For some reason, there's F-16, so there's fighter aircraft, but there's not enough slots in some of these training centers to get the pilots up and going. But based on the pilots that have been trained, I believe it's around 20.
There's at least 20 that we know of, and then we have a dozen more in France that are training on simulators as well. And let me just throw this out there. Until we hear directly from either President Zelensky, Mr. Yermak, President Biden, or anybody at the National Security Council of the United States, let's not take these numbers that are being supposedly leaked as fact. But even if we are looking at 20 or 30 pilots preparing to take to the skies against the Russians, that's 20 or 30 more than we've had for the last 28 months of the full-scale invasion, in a much better equipped jet than we have had since the beginning of the full-scale invasion as well.
Right. When Poland donated its old MiGs and whatnot, they didn't really offer much in capabilities. They allowed Ukraine to have more aircraft, but that's about it. With F-16, it'll be a little bit different. What's your understanding of the capability that the F-16 will provide in the initial stages of it being launched?
Another tool in the toolbox. Everyone had this notion, and the reason I jumped in a second ago about the game changer, everybody had this idea that if we had the F-16s, it was going to be this, quote, game changer. Colonel General Syrski, the team at the Air Force, and the team across all Ukrainian defense forces understand this is a multifaceted war with combined arms, so we need every tool in the toolbox. And what, again, we're going to be focused on is making certain that the civilian population of Ukraine is not at risk of being genocided by Putin's regime. The F-16s are going to go a long way in guaranteeing the safety of the Ukrainian civilian population while the Ukrainian defense forces go ahead and get back in a more focused and offensive manner against the Russian enemy.
Exactly. Now that'll be crucial, and of course we all are waiting for this. But we need to be sober and under the impression that while the ammunition stocks may have been replenished right now, there's some on the diplomatic front. Fantastic. President Zelensky getting 15 countries to sign bilateral security agreements, long term. Poland is still in the waiting line. I asked the foreign minister, he said that that's in the pipeline, so that will be coming along soon, maybe before the NATO summit. But in terms of longevity and predictability, that's probably going to be something that is going to be focused on at the NATO summit, and that's something that Ukraine desperately needs, right? It can't fight and then run out like pretty much like what we saw, because then it loses ground. So in terms of longevity, are you seeing the proper signals right now at this time that you think you're confident to say that the support will be indeed continuous and sufficient enough to achieve?
I think one of the goals. Well, you said stability as well in there. And one of the key factors is that the Ukrainian people, by and large, continue to support President Zelensky's leadership. So when our international partners see the stability in Kyiv under President Zelensky and his team, they feel more confident to be able to continue to give us the tools necessary to once again carry out the military plans under Colonel General Syrski that will eventually lead us to victory. And that ties into what's going to be happening at the NATO summit. President Zelensky is going to come there after having had dozens and dozens of countries sign on to the communique at the peace summit. He's going to come there in hand with already more than a dozen bilateral security agreements, long-term, as you mentioned. So instead of it being in 2022 or 2023, where we were sort of guessing the process, now we see that Ukraine is a clear partner to the NATO countries and not just some country looking to, hang around the edges. Ukraine is the key to NATO security and safety on the Eastern Front. This is what our partners understand, and they realize under the leadership of President Zelensky, we can achieve the goals that they need, which is to ensure democracy and stability around the globe.
Here in Central and Eastern Europe, looking at the Vilnius summit last year, and then, of course, looking forward to the Washington, D.C. summit this year, well, the leaders of our region obviously want much tougher wording, as does Ukraine,
Yes.
on Ukraine's future in NATO. From the Ukrainian perspective, we hear this a lot, this tagline, tougher wording, but from the Ukrainian perspective, what is that?
I leave the diplomacy up to the diplomats. I'll answer some military questions as best I can see fit. That said, we in Ukraine, especially in the military, have exceeded every expectation that was first thrust upon us when saving freedom for the other countries in the NATO coalition was at stake. If Ukraine would have fallen, we know the domino effect would have been real. The countries in the Baltics have discussed this. Poland has been a key leader in amplifying this message that Russia would have been a threat to every other country there on the Eastern Front. So what we're going to...
Still can be.
And still can be.
Yeah.
But Ukraine is victory, and so we also understand that. However, what does that victory look like? And that's where our NATO partners come in. The tough language is needed, and when the delegation gets to Washington, D.C., there has to be a hope that they have seen what's been produced, they've seen how the success of the peace summit unfolded, and ultimately they're going to be ready to stand face to face with Putin and his allies in the North Korean administration. We see in Tehran, we're seeing this cabal of evil and criminal acts across the globe, and NATO realizes if they don't stand with Ukraine, this criminal cabal will be able to run rampant over freedom and liberty around the world.
Sgt AshtonCirillo, the NCO, active NCO, Ukrainian Armed Forces, thank you very much for joining me. Always appreciate it.
Slava Ukraini, and thank you to the people of Poland, always.
Heroям slava. Last weekend's Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland saw the attendance of dozens of countries, many of which had previously been uninvolved in efforts to support Kyiv. But not all countries agreed to sign the joint statement at the end.
The Ukraine Peace Summit was held with the primary goal of bringing on board countries that have so far taken little interest in the conflict. The joint communiqué adopted at the end focused on three key issues. First, ensuring the safety of nuclear infrastructure with the explicit mention of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Second, condemning the attack on infrastructure used for food exports and calling for open transport through the Black and Azov Sea, important for food supplies to the global south. And last, the call for the release of all prisoners of war, as well as for the return of displaced Ukrainian civilians, including children.
Despite those different points of view, we have managed to agree on a common vision here on the Bürgenstock. We have set out that vision in the Bürgenstock communiqué. Herewith we are sending a clear signal to the people of Ukraine and to all those directly affected by the consequences of the war. A large part of the international community has the desire to bring change.
Over 82 delegations from various states and international organizations signed the communiqué. However, some of the countries that sent a delegation declined to sign the joint statement. Among them were India, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, and the United Arab Emirates. They gave a variety of reasons for the refusal. India and Saudi Arabia cited the absence of Russia at the summit. While Moscow's delegation was not invited, it also clearly said it would not attend, even if invited. South Africa, on the other hand, cited the presence of Israel, which it accuses of violating international law, at the summit and on the list of the signatories.
I hope that we can achieve results as soon as possible, and it is exactly these and other similar practical steps to restore security and peace that will prove to everyone in the world that the UN Charter can be restored to full effectiveness.
While the summit did not achieve what some would call a complete success, it did bring implicitly onto the Ukrainian side a number of countries and organizations which previously expressed little interest in the war.
And now I'd like to welcome to the program Timofiy Mylovanov, advisor to the office of the Ukrainian president. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine This Week. Now, we were just speaking about the peace summit that was in Switzerland over the weekend. And, well, some people are calling it maybe not such the biggest success, but from the Ukrainian perspective, and based on how many countries were present and how many people actually did sign the final communique, would you guys call it a success?
I think what's missed in this discussion is what the conversation is about. In Switzerland, the conversation was about food security, nuclear security, and protection of children from deportation, and also protection of prisoners and prisoners exchange. And so why these issues are important today to Ukraine, they also resonate with many, many other countries around the world. And these are the principles, 3 out of 10 in the peace formula proposed by Zelensky, that are more or less uncontroversial. And it is indeed a success because 57 heads of states and close to 100 countries and organizations attended the summit. So yes, from the political perspective, from this power angles, from the optics for Ukraine, it's one of the first, if not the first, global summit organized by Ukraine, bringing 90 countries and 57 heads of states is a big success. But I think also in terms of rhetoric, it's important that Ukraine is talking not about territory or not about power struggle with Russia, but about the principles which can sustain peace in the future.
Now, a lot of people have criticized the absence of Russia. And then we've also heard the counter-argument that at the current time, and especially with Russia giving its own demands that it gave, it's simply non-conducive to sitting down with Russia. Are there plans to sit down with Russia in the future, or does Ukraine need to achieve more success on the battlefield to come at any type of negotiations from a position of strength?
Well, so both countries in any war try to achieve a position of strength towards negotiations. So that's normal rhetoric. Also, Russia is going to be at some point, obviously, as many observers, including Ukrainians, say, a part of the discussion, because it would be strange otherwise, no matter what the reality is. But the question is, what are we discussing? What is the negotiations in good faith? And are we discussing the same aspects or the same issues? So Russia is discussing in their proposal, President Putin is putting forward proposals about territorial and about recognition of the basically violation of the international law and territorial integrity. If we go that way as the world community, if we agree to those solutions or principles, that means sustainable peace is not possible. It's actually going to create principles and precedents for the future wars. Whereas what Ukraine or Switzerland, people in Switzerland, countries we're talking about, should sustain peace. So the question is, when can we converge to something which will be about the peace, not only today in Ukraine, but also about future in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Now, concerning this upcoming NATO summit, we have that 75th anniversary summit. Of course, Ukraine is invited to attend in Washington, D.C. The leaders of Central and Eastern European countries, not all of them, and there's a few maybe that we can tick off that will not be included in that, but by and large, most of the leaders from our region want tougher wording on the future of Ukraine's join NATO. Can you give us a feel for what that exactly means in real terms? And how likely is it that there will be tougher wording coming out of that summit?
Well, the wording is one thing, the actions, another. So wording is possible, but it's clear for now that the United States and some other countries in NATO, they take a very careful approach towards NATO expansion. Partly because Russia is trying to play this tune and say, well, NATO is aggressive, and some of domestic politics, including in the United States, using these arguments. So that all creates a background or context within which it's very difficult to talk about adding or providing very specific plans towards expansion of NATO. However, countries which are not NATO, they would like to become NATO countries because exactly of the protection, exactly because Russia is being aggressive. Had Russia not been aggressive, Finland and Sweden wouldn't be, joining NATO right now. So what we expect from the summit in Washington is to provide certain specific paths where the optics will be non-escalatory, but in terms of capacity building, coordination, and alignment with NATO of non-NATO partners, there will be progress and specific strategies.
Right. I think Jens Stoltenberg was alluding to that, saying that they want to make it so that when that day comes, Ukraine can join immediately by having its forces ready to fully integrate into NATO. I'd like to ask you about the choice of Mark Rutte for the next Secretary General of NATO. How is that being perceived in Ukraine? I know that here, again, in our region, we were all hoping to get someone like Kaja Kallas was in the running, and I'm sure there's a list of Polish people that would have liked to take the helm of NATO. But still, NATO, once again, it looks like many countries tending to pick somebody from Western Europe. So what is the perception of that in Ukraine?
So we are happy and we will support, and we think it's a great candidate. But you just touched on a different topic. What's the role of Central Europe, of the newer Europe? And I think the gravity, the political influence of those countries like Poland, like the Baltics, especially in NATO, has been increasing. Partly because they understand the threat they are facing. They are these countries, Ukraine too, but we are not a part of NATO. But these countries are NATO front countries. They are facing Russia today. They are facing sabotage operations, cyber attacks, political polarization, and all kinds of destabilization activities by Russia. So these countries understand what's at stake. And I think it's only a question of time until the leadership of NATO will be represented also by the leaders from these countries.
In recent weeks, we've seen, a massive amount of bilateral security agreements. President Zelensky has been on quite a diplomatic tour. I think we're at number 15, if I'm not mistaken, and I think we're going to get to 20 or so around the time of the NATO summit, hopefully. With the signing of all these agreements, with this commitment that they're trying to get through, $40 billion in military assistance and financial assistance by NATO countries for Ukraine per year, does that give Ukraine the predictability? Is that enough for Ukraine to start achieving the goal of victory, which I think still needs to be politically defined by the West? But is it going to be satisfactory? Will it produce results?
Well, so the victory has to be defined both by Ukraine and the allies together. So it's not just defined by the West. And in particular by countries around Ukraine, which are facing that threat. Now, will that be enough? Well, that, of course, depends on details, on the efficiency of the use of this aid. $40 billion is a lot of money. It's about almost, 40, slightly more percentage of what Russia uses on defense budget per year. So alone, that might not be enough to achieve parity, but it might be enough with some other support that Ukraine is getting. But then the question is really going to be very technical efficiency. But what this network of agreements is trying to establish is some form of infrastructure and security guarantees, which not immediately replicate NATO security framework, but at least, as we just talked about it, getting closer towards that.
All right. Well, Timofiy Mylovanov, advisor at the Office of the Ukrainian President, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts here on Ukraine This Week. We appreciate it. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And, of course, tune in next week. And if you miss it, watch it on YouTube. See you next time.